Hello, Dr. Michael Arnhem here again with Bernard the Barrister Bear. Say hello, Bernard. Hello. And this time we're talking about writing to the king. Writing to the king. It was actually pathetic to see how many people turned out to pay their respects to the late Queen Elizabeth. There was a great outpouring of grief. And what is particularly strange is that so many people seem to think they had a connection with the Queen. Well, most of them had never met her, or if they had, it would have been on some formal occasion, and that would have been it. Mailbag? Well, Bernard reminds me that the Queen got a mailbag of about 250 letters every single day from people asking her for her assistance. Not only that, but a lot were of that kind. And what response did they get? Yes, they mostly did get a response. They got a reply, but not from the Queen. No, it was usually signed by a lady-in-waiting, saying, "I am commanded by Her Majesty the Queen," and so on. But what did it really say? Well, a lot of the letters referred the matter to an appropriate government department, local authority, or some other institution. Otherwise, the letters would say, basically, sorry, the Queen doesn't have authority to help you. And that is really the long and the short of it. The Queen, or the King now, has no actual power. No actual power. So, why do people carry on doing this? Well, where else have they got to go? They can write to the Prime Minister. There they'll get even shorter shrift. Or they can write to their Member of Parliament. Sometimes that does work, but not that often either. Actually, the irony is that when there really was a monarchy in this country, when the king really had power, the common people benefited. The greater the power of the king, the greater the benefit to the ordinary people. Really? Yes. It's not well recognized because there's been so much propaganda about the so-called democracy that there is now, which is far from being a democracy, and the advantages of restricting the power of the crown. Well, actually, it's exactly the opposite, as I have demonstrated in some of my writings, like a book called Two Models of Government, and more recently also Why Rome Fell. So you're very welcome to read those books. And it's not actually paradoxical at all, because the worst enemy of strong monarchy comes from vested interests, aristocracy, and other powerful interests. And therefore, what has taken over from monarchy is not democracy, no, but oligarchy. Oligarchy, meaning the rule of the few being few top dogs in various spheres. They don't necessarily all link up together. There's not one oligarchy. It's a group of privileged interests, privileged people. Several groups. And if we go back in history, you'll see what I mean. way back in 1381, the peasants' revolt. The peasants revolted in the name of the king, thinking that the king, Richard II, would be on their side against the nobles who were their enemy. And the king, Richard II, very, very young at the time, did come out in favor of the peasants briefly and then changed his mind. Didn't do him much good in the end. Later we find under the Tudors, started in 1485, the so-called Court of Requests, a special court set up really in the interest of the poor and much cheaper and quicker than the ordinary law courts, and actually was greatly hated by the judges of the ordinary law courts who tried to shut it down, which eventually they did when, and not surprisingly, when the monarchy lost its power in 1640, the time of the outbreak of the Civil War, Charles I, 1640, 42, around there. Court of Requests, particularly under the rather strangely named Sir Julius Caesar. The Star Chamber, which has a very bad reputation to this day as a result of propaganda, is another example, particularly during the reign of Charles I. This was a court which acted very much in the interests of the ordinary people, and in particular tried to prevent the rich and landed aristocracy and gentry from enclosing common lands, enclosure movement. But with the Civil War, 1642 really, onwards, that was the end of any attempt to stop enclosure. And as a result, subsequently, the common people lost all those common lands and eventually had to drift into the towns, the cities, to work in what later became, of course, in the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century and onwards, 19th century, became the factories of the Industrial Revolution, because they were displaced from the land by the enclosure movement. The enclosure movement was temporarily stopped while the king was powerful, in particular during the so-called 11 years tyranny. Still called that by most historians. It was just the opposite. It was a period when the common people benefited from royal power, Charles I. So that is the true story of royal power. But of course all that has gone, together with most of the so-called prerogative powers of the crown, including, for example, the power to grant pardons, the prerogative of mercy, royal pardons. That is now taken over by the courts, which again is completely against the interests of ordinary people. The power in America, for example, it's still in the hands of the executive. That's the king, of course, is the head of the executive, supposedly. But in America, it still is. The president, and on a state level, the governors, have the power of pardoning. Power still exists there in the executive, not here anymore. So what are you left with? Well, you have to resort to the law courts. And this is one of the biggest problems, because the law is in such a bad state. The word disarray has been used to refer to the law of tort, not by me, but by Lord Neuberger, the former president of the UK Supreme Court. It says it's in a state of disarray with a marked lack of reliable principle. We'll have to say more about that in future videos. More next time. Bye-bye.